Hello everyone, Hopefully No Editor 357 here, and for today's Don't Stop December video, I am ranking the 8 original Higurashi When They Cry story arcs. I know there are a lot of bonus Higurashi chapters and stories, but I unfortunately have not read them all. I have read some of the bonus chapters made available by the 7th mod, and the epilogue dice killing chapter, but that's as far as I've gone. I'd love to do a ranking video including every bonus chapter, after having played all the ones I can get access to, but for the sake of sticking to my Don't Stop December schedule of one video per day, I'll just be taking a look at the 8 main Higurashi story arcs. Also, I will be discussing specific story details in this video, so naturally spoiler warning if you haven't read or seen Higurashi When They Cry. All that being said, let's begin. In last place is the second Higurashi story arc, the Cotton Drifting chapter. Now don't get me wrong, I still love this chapter and think it's a great piece of When They Cry storytelling. There's just one thing that drags this chapter down and why I decided to put it in last place. The pacing. I loved the pacing in chapter 1. Aside from the morbid opening, it's mostly just everyday slice-of-life shenanigans between Keiichi and the main cast, with hints at the darker mystery involving Oyashiro-sama's curse spread throughout these upbeat days. It worked wonderfully to introduce you to all the characters, get you attached to them, and lull you into a false sense of security which makes the later parts of the story, when Keiichi starts becoming suspicious of everyone around him, that much more engaging and tragic in nature. My problem with the second one is, it does the exact same thing, which worked for an introduction to Higurashi, but since players have already read the first one, and know everything's not as perfect as it seems at first, it just ends up making the happy-go-lucky everyday life segments drag a bit. And then it's not until halfway through the story do things start to get serious again. Now don't get me wrong, there is a lot to love in this chapter. The earlier mystery of if Shion is even a real person or not is a wonderfully handled mini-mystery that kept me interested and was a very clever way of revealing Mion's feelings towards Keiichi. This chapter also introduces Shion, who is a key part to many of the stories going forward. I think the more emotional character writing for Keiichi is amazing. Chapter 1 focused mostly on him being paranoid and lamenting the fact that he can't trust everyone like he used to after the Watanagashi festival, but this chapter really gave him some good character development and emotional moments, specifically when he thinks Rika and Satoko disappearing is his fault, and earlier in the story when he realizes that Mion has feelings for him. Ryukishi 7 did a great job of giving Keiichi satisfying character development and growth throughout the story, since I wouldn't say he was a blank slate in Chapter 1, but compared to the rest of the cast he was definitely on the less interesting side, in my opinion. So overall, I still love the Cotton Drifting chapter. I think it's an amazing piece of Higurashi When They Cry storytelling, with a great introduction to one of my favorite Higurashi characters, Shion, and it has a good focus on developing Keiichi as a character and putting him through the emotional ringer. It's just that its slow pacing after the dramatic and intense ending of Chapter 1 drags it down in my opinion, and that's why it's in spot number 8 for the rankings. Up next in the rankings is... In spot number 7 is the 4th Higurashi story arc, the Time Killing chapter. I love how this chapter gives readers a look at Hinamizawa that we've never had before this point. A look at what it was like 5 years before the main story starts, and in the middle of the much discussed dam war. I also like how this story shows us the ending of the dam war, and brings readers to the realization that Rika has knowledge on what is going to happen to Hinamizawa and herself in the future. After the intense ending of the Curse Killing chapter, we get a relatively straightforward story where we get to see what the dam war was like, only to be reminded towards the end thanks to Rika's interactions with Akasaka that there are seemingly supernatural forces at work in Hinamizawa. Overall, the Time Killing chapter is definitely a shift in tone compared to the last chapter, but it's a welcome change of perspective that I think is a cool way to close out the question arcs part of Higurashi's story. I also just love Akasaka's character, and the final scene with him and Oishi discussing the great Hinamizawa disaster was a really cool way of incorporating the name of the series, Higurashi When They Cry, into the story itself by having it be a book they made. Up next in spot number 6 for the rankings is the 7th Higurashi story arc, the Massacre chapter. This chapter had such a creative way of revealing the truth behind the overall mystery, by putting the readers in the perspective of someone who already knows most of what's going on. I love that this chapter is through Rika's perspective, after having been shown through chapters 4 and 6 that she has knowledge of both what is going to happen to Hinamizawa and the specific happenings of each story chapter up to this point. Having her very casually talk about characters like Ire, Tomitake, and Takano, but as she knows them, not the way Keiichi or the other protagonists have known them up to this point, was such a cool way of revealing who they really are. Instead of just having an exposition dump, which we do still get from her in regards to Tokyo's part in the story and their motivation, which I understand, but rather having us learn the truth by just putting us in the perspective of someone who already knows most of what's going on, I really do admire that decision. Also, it's the reader's first proper introduction to Hanyu, which is reason enough to make this chapter great. The story really is just filled with amazing moments. From Keiichi and the main cast facing off against the head of the Sonozaki family to help Satoko finally asking to be saved from her abusive uncle over the phone, to the scene where it's revealed that Takano is the villain of the series. This chapter is an emotional roller coaster from start to finish, and I love how it served the purpose of giving Rika, the true protagonist of Higurashi When They Cry, who had become so hopeless through many fragments ending badly to say the least for her and her friends, hope that fate can be changed and that she can escape her loop of misery with her friends. It's an amazing story on its own. I especially love finally getting to see the story from Rika's perspective after being shown that she is aware of both the future and events of the chapters up to this point. And this chapter also just has a really creative way of revealing the truth behind the majority of Higurashi's mysteries. I also love the scene at the end where Hanyu becomes determined to become an active player in the next fragment, so that way everyone can work together to get their happy ending. Up next in spot number 5 for the rankings is the 5th Higurashi Story Arc, the eye-opening chapter. I'll admit, when I first realized the protagonist role was being shifted to Shion for this episode, I was a little worried. But holy crap did she make for an amazing main character to this story arc. The writing for Shion, her relationship with Satoshi, and her eventual descent into insanity and killing of so many people was some of the most engaging reading I've ever experienced in a visual novel. I was on the edge of my seat the whole time. The eye-opening arc is easily the most disturbing and creepy Higurashi story arc. I mean, the Satoko murder scene alone is probably one of the most well-known moments in the entire series. Also, the way reading this story arc gives you a whole new perspective on the cotton drifting arc is insane. Like, it expanded on everything great from the cotton drifting arc while also revealing the truth behind the story, and it still works great as a standalone story, which is no easy feat. Also, some of the monologues Shion has throughout this episode are some of my favorite from Higurashi. Ryukishi 7 really does know how to make some of the most intense and eloquently written monologues I've ever had the pleasure of reading. Also, this chapter finally lets readers see and meet Satoshi properly, which after spending so long hearing about him was really great. Up next in spot number 4 for the rankings is the very first Higurashi story arc, the Demoned Away chapter. This story arc serves as an amazing introduction to the world and story of Higurashi When They Cry, as well as acting as a great standalone story. The first scene captures your attention right away, and then Ryukishi 7 crafts a story with a perfect balancing act between happy everyday life with the main cast, and then hints of a dark mystery being concealed by the residents of Hinamizawa in between these everyday happenings. The fun games between Keiichi and the main cast get you attached to the main characters, while also hinting about their past and secrets cleverly. And this attachment to the characters is used wonderfully during the second half in the story, where Keiichi realizes everything isn't as perfect as it seems and he can't figure out who he can trust anymore. To me, this is Higurashi at some of its finest. Creepy and paranoia-induced writing that keeps readers guessing what's really going on, while also being a tragic tale. Keiichi's sorrow over uncovering some of Hinamizawa's secrets and his desire to just go back to the happy, normal life he had with his friends up to that point is so heartbreaking. Especially during the short period of time where he tries to ignore all the creepy stuff he's experienced and just go back to everyday life with his friends, only to realize he can't keep the facade up. When I wasn't being creeped out by Reina shouting liar, or wondering if maybe needles is just a normal ingredient in rice balls, I felt so bad for Keiichi and was wondering how he was going to be able to get out of the situation he found himself in. All this culminating in the ending that makes readers want to discover the truth behind Higurashi. For the sake of Keiichi and everyone else who had lost their lives, just makes this a top-tier Higurashi story in my opinion and a wonderful introduction to one of my favorite series of all time. Up next in spot number 3 for the rankings is the 8th and final of the main Higurashi story arcs, the festival accompanying chapter. Takano's tragic backstory and excellent writing for a character alone is enough to make this chapter one of my favorites. But everything else about this chapter is fantastic as well. Everything comes full circle, every character has a part to play in the final conflict, every loose end is answered thanks to the beginning segment where you're witnessing various events in the Higurashi timeline, and the ending itself is just so well done. For any number of other series, I wouldn't be a fan of the main cast works together and manages to solve their problems without losing anyone type of story, but it just feels so earned with Higurashi. Throughout 7 chapters, we've watched these characters just suffer the worst fates because of lack of trust between each other, or the emotional or psychological problems each character had to work through. But even though that happened to them in different versions of themselves in other fragments, they've learned from these mistakes and now realize that there is strength in relying on your friends for help. When life seems hopeless or it seems like fate itself is against you, don't give up and rely on your friends and you can beat fate together. For all the horror elements or bloody murders there are in Higurashi's story, it is really a story about hope and the power that comes from forming close bonds with the people you have in your life. The murder and horror that happens in Higurashi really is only because of the tragic mistrust and circumstances that plague the characters in every chapter. That's why it's so satisfying to see every main character in Higurashi come together to defy fate and derail Takano's plan. Even Hanyu takes part when she up to this point had mostly been an observer. I feel like, especially for a series like Higurashi with so many different characters and alternate endings from each chapter, It's hard to make a truly satisfying ending that doesn't feel like it's just the main characters winning super easily. But thankfully Ryukishi 7 built the characters and story threads so wonderfully up to this point, and made the payoff for all of them so satisfying. And poor Rika, who has been trapped in a loop of death for so many years, finally gets a happy ending with her friends, which is just so satisfying to see. And I'm really glad even Takano is going to get the help she needs. There's no denying that the things she's done in other fragments and the stuff she was planning to do in this chapter were atrocious. But damn, her backstory is unbelievably tragic to the point where I'm not surprised she ended up the way she did. Don't get me wrong, again, what she was planning to do was horrible, but she is a broken person, and I really love antagonists who aren't just evil for evil's sake, but rather because of their tragic, complicated lives up to the point of the main story. This satisfying ending to Higarashi's story, and great conclusion to every character's story arc, is why the festival accompanying chapter is my third favorite Higarashi story arc. And up next in the rankings in spot number 2 is the 6th Higarashi story arc, the Atonement chapter. One of my favorite things about this chapter is the ending. It's the first Higarashi chapter to have a hopeful ending. Sadly, Rika does still die and the Great Hinamizawa disaster still happens in this fragment, but it's the first glimpse of hope for Rika when she sees that Keiichi can remember events from other fragments. Specifically, the mistake he made of being so suspicious of his friends in the first chapter, and learn from those mistakes to make a better future for everyone and help his friends. Speaking of, this chapter just feels like the first step to the finale of the series. We already knew beforehand that Rika had some supernatural, prophetic-like abilities, but we finally get confirmation that every story arc beforehand has actually happened, and it's not like time is simply being reset at the end of every chapter. It is still very time loop-esque, but in reality it's Rika going to different fragments after her death in each chapter. And the revelation that the other story arcs did actually happen was handled so cleverly, by having Keiichi regain memories from chapter 1 because he sees Reina going down the same dark path that he did. The scene where he remembers and hugs Mion because of the sorrow he feels over having killed her and Reina in the previous fragment was just so good. And icing on the already great characterization of Keiichi in this episode. Learning about his past, how he regrets what he's done, and how he's terrified of his friends learning about his past actions, and then seeing his friends accept him despite his bad actions in the past was just all so great. I was worried that as more characters were added and the story came closer to its finale, that Keiichi was going to get not as much focus or interesting character development, so I'm glad to see he had just as much emotional depth and character growth as the rest of the cast. And he essentially acted as a beacon of hope for Rika in this fragment, as she got to witness him learn from his past fragment's mistakes and save Reina. In other words, he's definitely not the most interesting out of the Higurashi cast, but I still love Keiichi's character and his importance to the story, especially in this chapter, should never be overlooked. Also, of course, the focus of this chapter, Reina, the writing for her character was amazing. Seeing her backstory and eventual descent into insanity was really amazing. Reina had always been one of my favorite characters I wanted to learn more about as I went through Higurashi, so finally getting a chapter partially through her perspective was great. I also liked as she became more and more unstable, how the perspective would switch to Keiichi to properly show what's going on. It was a very clever way of revealing that everything Reina thinks to be true actually isn't, and that's when the parallels between chapter 1 and 6 become more and more clear. And lastly, the fight scene between her and Keiichi on the roof is one of my all-time favorite Higurashi moments. It's just such an exciting and emotional scene as Reina slowly starts to realize she doesn't want to be hurting her friends and fighting Keiichi. As many flaws as Sotsu did have, I did love the recreation of that scene they did in episode 14. I think I've ranted long enough. All these reasons is why the Atonement chapter is my second favorite Higurashi story arc. And up next in the rankings for my favorite story arc is the third Higurashi story arc, the Curse Killing chapter. This chapter is such an emotional roller coaster. I actually never liked Satoko up to this point. I found her to be annoying, but learning about her past and just how rough a life she's had made me do a 180 real fast. And actually appreciate the fact that at the beginning of the story she's able to laugh, have fun with her friends, and enjoy life again. Of course, we all know that doesn't last because her uncle comes back. And the actual anger and sorrow I felt while reading this chapter, and seeing how miserable Satoko was, and knowing she was suffering abuse at the hands of this scum of a person, very few stories can make me feel actual anger towards a fictional character. There are plenty of characters in other stories that have done horrible things that I still don't like them, but since at the end of the day they're fictional stories, I don't find myself ever getting enraged by them. I'll still get emotional in other ways during stories, like I'll get sad and maybe tear up when a character I like dies, but never anger. That uncle though, I was cheering when Keiichi was hunting him down, even though I know murder wasn't the best way to solve the situation at hand. The emotional writing for both seeing Satoko's situation and Keiichi's frustration at his powerlessness to do anything was amazing. This chapter further added to the great emotional depth he got in the cotton drifting chapter. The scene where he lashes out at his friends for supposedly not doing anything, and then Reina lashes back at him saying what he's going to do, Every character really gets a moment to shine in this story, and I just love the tense writing for the interactions between everyone as they try to think of ways to help Satoko's situation to no avail. Also, Keiichi's 1500 seconds monologue when he realizes he can just kill Tepe, that gave me chills on how sudden but well written it was. Seeing Keiichi, who up to this point was acting as a hot-headed emotional mess with good intentions, suddenly take on this cold and calculating persona as he resolves himself to kill Satoko's uncle, and everyone noticing that he seems different, that's another one of my favorite Higurashi moments. Everything else about this story is great too. I love the mystery elements, such as everyone saying Keiichi was at the festival when he was supposed to be killing Tepe, how Tepe's corpse was missing and Keiichi didn't know why, how when Keiichi wished people to die, they supposedly died according to his wishes, and the whole final act starting with Keiichi finding Satoko in the bathtub up to where he falls off the bridge and wishes all of Hinamizawa would die is such an exhilarating, tense, and emotional sequence of events, and overall, it felt like the perfect finale to the question arc side of the story, even though Ryukishi 7 ended up making one more in between the answer arcs. I love the introduction of the Great Hinamizawa disaster, which, as we know, becomes a very important story element going forward. The curse-killing chapter just took everything I loved about the 2 chapters before it, the tense and creepy writing mixed with great emotional character development, and turned the mystery and confusion factor up to 11 with all the crazy stuff that wouldn't be explained until later story arcs. When I got to the 1500-second monologue by Keiichi, I knew right away that Higurashi would go down as one of my favorite visual novel series, or actually really one of my favorite series ever. It just cemented Higurashi as the amazing piece of storytelling that was truly unlike anything I had ever seen before. And all of the reasons I just stated is why the curse-killing chapter is, in my opinion, the best Higurashi When They Cry story arc and earns its place in spot number 1 of the rankings. Well everyone, thank you for watching this video. If how long the written script ended up being is any indicator, this video is probably a bit longer than my other Don't Stop December videos, but the time I spent on this script was well worth it. I had such a blast going through the main Higurashi story arcs and trying to rank them, and it was really difficult to decide for myself which I thought deserved to be on the higher up side of the rankings, because I really do love all the Higurashi chapters. I think they're all amazing for their own reasons and they all come together wonderfully to tell the story that is Higurashi When They Cry. So, all that being said, please tell me what you thought of this video in the comments below. Did you agree with my rankings? And if not, what is your rankings for the 8 main Higurashi story arcs? I love talking about the When They Cry series, so discussing everyone's personal rankings of the Higurashi story arcs sounds like a great time. And if you enjoyed this video, please also consider giving it a like and share. And if you would like to see more content from me in the future, I doubt this will be the last time I do a Higurashi or When They Cry in general related video, please consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you again to everyone watching this video, and see you guys in the next video, which since it's Don't Stop December, is tomorrow.